Today on the Chris Joslyn Show, we are sponsored by Orion Solutions Group. Don't waste any more time trying to find the perfect fit for your team. Trust Orion Solutions Group to help you make the best hiring decisions for your business. Experts placing experts. Orion Solutions Group. Well, hello, everyone. We're here for another edition of the Chris Joslyn Show. I am your host, not Chris Joslyn. My name is Jennifer. And here at Dare More Media and iLevel Logistics, we are excited to switch the camera around and instead do a little interview of our Rhodes Scholar, Chris Joslyn. Hello there, Chris. How are you today?
I am doing wonderfully well this morning. How about yourself?
Wonderfully well. I quite like that description.
If I was any better, I'd be two people.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, I'm really excited. We're planning on doing a couple talks about some very important, five very important things that businesses need to keep on the forefront of their mind, not just in the transportation and logistics industry, but pretty much across all industries. Is that right?
Yeah, thank you. And you know, one of the things I think that is a crossover between many of industries, it's a commonality between industries, between businesses, is to really have a strategic plan going forward. You might have some wonderful goals. You might have some things you're trying to reach for and develop. But if you don't have a strategy, you don't get there. One of my favorite sayings is that you need to put your goals in cement, but your plans in sand.
Oh, that's
that
good.
Doesn't mean you don't have a strategic plan. That means you set one up and then it's got to be malleable. It's got to be changeable.
Right. You
got to be able to adapt with the winds of change that seem to hit us, especially in the transportation industry.
I like that. So your goals in concrete, plans in the sand. Very well said. Very well said. Well, we have a couple questions for you today. We'd love to get your insight on strategic planning, which of course is number one in the 5 elements we are planning on doing this series. So first question, Chris.
Sure. I'm prepared.
Good. Can you describe the role of strategic planning in the transportation and logistics industry?
I would say that the goal in the industry is not ubiquitous. It's not the same for every company. The transportation industry is very diverse. There's so many different segments. There's so many different niches. There's different size of companies based on their revenue, based on the type of business they are trying to develop. And oftentimes, a lot of the businesses are small, individually owned, maybe a couple of trucks type of business. So the strategies often change depending on that. Anytime you start to develop a strategy, you need to do so, from my perspective, with having the end in mind. And I don't mean the end of your company, hopefully. You know, if you have the end of your company, your strategy probably needed to be looked at a little more closely before you put it into action steps. But to actually say, where am I trying to get this thing in 3, 5, 10 years, and then work backward from there? So the strategy may be different from company to company, but there's kind of a framework that can be developed, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. Second question. Are you ready? How do you ensure that your strategic plans align with the overall goals and objectives of your organization?
It's kind of a 2-prong answer for me, I think. You almost have to look at things both from the inside of your company for that strategy to align, and then from a more umbrellaed, larger point of view, industry level alignment. Because I've noticed in the past in some of the companies that I've dealt with, and even some that I've been a part of, that you can focus so much internally on getting from point A to point B and having a certain, looking at the numbers very closely and developing margins and revenues and processes and stuff that fit your particular company, that you put secondary to that the needs and the strategies maybe you need to develop around the wider, bigger picture. Ultimately, any company that's product or even service oriented, like transportation typically is, must keep in the forefront of their minds their customers' needs, their customers' wants, their customers' desires, from the individuals that you're dealing with at those companies to the strategy of that company trying to get their product on the shelf perhaps, or get something moving on the train, or get their trucks moving, or creating a network or a balance. So oftentimes it's to answer it more fully, is there's there's two strategies that go into place. One that focuses on the internal metrics that you're developing to try to make your company successful, and the other is how does that infiltrate the business in the industry at large.
Can you provide an example of a successful strategic planning initiative that you have led in the past, depending whether it was, something that you dealt with very early on, in the early days of your career, or maybe something more recently?
I was going to say sometimes you look back on things, and I think the rear view mirror often gives you an interesting gauge on what success really is. And back to your question a moment ago, a lot of companies will set up their success or their viewpoint of success based on certain things they need to accomplish. Might be just growing the company at a certain speed. It might be producing a certain margin. It might be instead looking at the top line revenue and saying our size is a certain thing. It might be strategically diversifying into multiple segments of the transportation industry. So the definition of success is important to the question first. But everybody has a definition of that. The people that are out there selling services and products are oftentimes have a variable to their compensation, some type of commission, some kind of element. Some of the people behind a desk doing customer service, some of the people in HR, some of the people at strategic management levels, or even the C-suite, they all have variance on what they view success is. But ultimately, I think you can boil it down to progress. Success is often best defined as moving in a direction that is consequentially important for all the people involved with the business that you're a part of. And, I've had some interesting things that I thought were successes that in the rearview mirror 3 or 4 years later perhaps had a greater negative impact on other segments of my company or the companies I've worked for in the past. So the definition is really important, but just to give one example, I worked with a large manufacturer in Mexico across about a 9-month period. They were engaging in change management at the time, for lack of a better way to put it. They brought in people from literally all over the world to try to develop some strategies on how to move their finished goods, not their raw materials to make their product, but their finished goods into the appropriate geographic areas of their market, or at least their identified target markets. And it was a haphazard strategy. There were 4 or 5 different divisions that all had priorities on this and all had, again, a different definition of internal success to make those markets happen. Some people's definition of success was just to simply get it off their manufacturing line. Some people's definition was to get it, in this case, across the border into Canada or the United States for distribution. And at the highest level, the definition of success is, did we make an impact on the market that they are trying to that they have competition in? Did they have more product on the shelf than their competitor? Did they look back in retrospect a year later and see that their revenue and their margins and their quantities in sales had gone up as opposed to their competitors? So we sat down, and it took about 9 months to develop not just strategies, but some basic technologies that allowed. There's something in most businesses that it's called KPIs. That's an acronym for key performance indicators. And the number one strategy that I put into place as part of the group of, there was probably a group of 12 of us at one time that sat down and kind of developed this strategy. Simple as whiteboarding at first, and as technical as developing some of their transportation management solutions at the backside. But what we really went after and tried to develop is what were the rankings of their key performance indicators. And once we had those defined, the rest kind of fell into place. Because once we had agreement at the table from those dozen people that these were the priorities, this was the first thing to keep in mind, this was the second, and then we weighted those. And I know this sounds simplistic, but at the end of the day, the best you can ever do is 100% of whatever you're trying to get done. And so if you weight those 10, 20 key performance indicators in a way that takes out a certain percentage toward your overall goal, your decision making becomes much easier. It takes the emotion and the differential success that those individuals wanted to happen out of the equation entirely. And now the agreed upon key performance indicators allow that strategy to come to fruition. I know that was a long-winded answer, but I think it's important to note that they're not to be avoided. Give you a quick example. People that love food. I mean, I love all kinds of food. I love spicy food. I love Italian. I love Mexican food. I love all kinds of food. There's other foods I don't like at all. But if I said, hey, I love food. I want to open an Italian restaurant. Well, okay, the world we live in North America will allow us the ability to go open that restaurant. But if I don't know how to cook, and if I don't know or place in the forefront of my mind in the people that start to work for me a strategy that's going to make us enough money to keep the thing going, then all I've done is create a hobby. I've created a situation that's going to eventually fail. So strategy, I think it's probably why it's number one on our 5 elements, right?
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Mm-hmm. I love that answer. I actually like how you talked about the KPIs, and that kind of segues us into our next question, actually. The question is, how do you measure success of your strategic planning initiatives? You mentioned the KPIs. Would you say that's pretty standard? Is there anything else that you would extend to that?
There's a second step to that. Once you have things in agreement, and once you move forward with a particular strategy and develop some history, then you've got to be able to organize the data points that you get from that history. And what I mean by that is, let's say there's 20 of those KPIs, and they all have a ranking and a value. Well, when you have a year in, let's say you have a year into the strategy, and you start looking at the historical results from that strategy, and you say, okay, we are moving toward the successes we want to, or we're not. Whatever the resulting analysis of that data will be, you then have an opportunity to put yourself into a category for continuous improvement. Okay? There's, people that take a lot of classes, get their black belt in Six Sigma, or have learned, this was probably 60, 70 years ago, Toyota. There's a book actually called The Toyota Way. And there's a very systematic method that the Toyota folks, again, 60, 70 years ago, started to, maybe it's not 70, it probably has been that long, it started to develop to create additional efficiencies within different segments of their huge portfolio of manufacturers and vendors and everything else. Very systematically. So, but all of that can be boiled down to the idea of trying to continuously improve. So once you start moving in a direction, you start analyzing that history and deciding what's the next steps. It's good to award yourself when you meet benchmarks and thresholds, and give yourself pats on the back for winning, for defining success as maybe a step along the way. But I don't know if you ever completely, it's a path. It's a path of progress, really. I think that's the best way I can define it.
The yellow brick road.
Yeah. As long as you don't pull back the curtain and find out Oz is just a guy with a big megaphone, right?
Of course. Now, how would you involve stakeholders such as employees, customers in the strategic planning process?
That is a wonderful question, Jen. It really is, because you don't live in a bubble in these things. There are always, I mentioned with the previous question that we had about a dozen of us around a table those were the stakeholders that were measuring the process that I was trying to forward and put together for that manufacturer. And I think it's real important to understand that perspectives are variant. It's great to try to come to an agreement, and that's why I talked about the KPIs in general, because it puts a wide net around the possibilities. If you went to a table with 12 stakeholders in an organization and tried to develop the right strategies, and there was agreement that only 2 things were important to the ideal of success, well, every single person has the different idea of what those 2 things are. So that means there's 24 important things to these people. That's That's the kind of net you need to start with to see how wide it is. Because if you only had me sitting in the room without involving the stakeholders that have these variant opinions on where we need to go or how we need to get there, then my two KPIs are the only important thing. And then when you eventually look back and try to continuously improve, you go, holy mackerel, we lost 20% instead of gained 20%. And I thought I was right the whole time. Well, we all think we're right, guys. We all do. We all have our perspective, and that's why it's important. I don't remember what the old saying is, but the whole two heads are better than one kind of thing. There's also a kind of a multiplicity or a multiplication factor that can be involved when you have a group of people that are willing to be open to conversation and open to apply their acumen and their time within a certain business segment to develop actual patterns, actual strategies for the success of something larger. And
what steps would you take to ensure that these strategic plans are actually effectively communicated throughout your organization, from, like you've mentioned, the C-suite level to the, entry-level candidates in your company?
A lot of people, both in industry and in governments and a whole lot of other segments, city planning, all this kind of stuff, they develop one of two patterns. Typically, it's one of two things. It's either a top-down strategy or a bottom-up strategy. There's this collective consciousness kind of strategy where you develop a questionnaire, for instance, within the population of employees with a large company. And from that questionnaire, you start to see patterns and develop something that, there's always the anomalous pieces on both sides of that questionnaire that you throw out, and you start looking at the median evaluation of whatever you're trying to evaluate. And then you create something from that, and you build it through consensus, right? That's not a bad. I'm not even going to say which I think is better or not. And then there's the strategy of the top down. Hopefully, the people at the top of an organization have climbed their way through an organization or multiple organizations, so they have experience, probably more experience than perhaps a lot of the people that may look at the bottom-up strategy. So using that experience, they may be able to filter out and narrow the focus on the strategy used to gain success. That's a good strategy too. But either way, my particular point of view is, maybe there's even a blend of those, but my particular point of view is you take a stair-step approach to whatever it goes back to my statement a few minutes ago, your goals in concrete and your plans in sand. The goals are not created at the bottom. They're just not. They're created by the people that have financial stakes in the company. Now, if it's an employee-owned company, that's a different thing entirely. But the stakeholders, the true financial stakeholders, have those things that they measure and want to put in cement. The goals in cement and the plans in sand, if you will. That's different. That's different. And having the wherewithal to put the goals in cement from the top down and maybe the plans in sand from the bottom up, maybe that's even a strategy. But work backward. The stair step thing that I mentioned before I get too far off the trail is not a stairway up. It's a stairway back. So my whole point is projections, forecasts, things like that. A lot of times it's garbage in, garbage out. But the reason people do that is they want to put in place the end of a fiscal year, of a fiscal quarter, of 5-year planning, 3-year planning, whatever it is. They develop numbers that reach out here. They curtail that with different things to try to make it realistic, if you will. And they say, okay, if that's where we want to be in 3 or 5 years, this is the revenue we want to hit, this is the margin we want to hit, this is the size of the company, this is the employee growth elements, this is the things we want to try to do in the industry, then you find out where you're going to be within that time frame, and then you say, where do I need to be at the halfway point? You know the numbers because you already put them together. Okay, so what are the big steps that go from the halfway point to the end? And now you split it in half again. What are the things we need to do? The elementary KPI associated steps in between all these things, and you keep breaking it down until you have, depends on the length of time we're talking about, maybe you break it down by quarter. You put 3 years and you have these quarterly segments, and you develop internal little steps in between all those. That way you have something to measure. If you're a pilot, you know this better than anybody. You have a flight plan, right? You put together a flight plan, and you're going from here to, Hong Kong. from let's say the west coast of California or west coast to Hong Kong. It's about a 14-hour trip. And the flight plan actually takes you kind of up around the edge of Alaska, the Aleutian Islands, and then down over the coast of Japan, Korea, and all the way down toward Hong Kong. 14 hours. That's a lot to plan. That's a length of time. And that, by the way, that's a lot of time to watch the little airplane move in your seat on the little screen. So hopefully you have some movies to watch. But the point is that the pilots up front know that they're going to have to do what the whole way. Every so often, they're going to have to gauge, our flight plan said we should be here. Oh, we're not quite there. We're slightly off. We've derivated from the original plan. Maybe there's too much wind. Maybe we took a slightly wrong course because of flying up toward Alaska and there's a new weather system coming in over there. Or maybe there's other air traffic that we need to avoid. Or maybe there's some turbulence happening over here that we're trying. So what they do is they course correct every so often. So if you've developed a strategy that's a stair-step approach from the end in mind first, backward, to determine what those steps are, the more steps you put in there, the more opportunities you have to look at it and say, ooh, we're on these KPIs, we're not quite right. How do we need to course correct? And that's how you develop the strategy. I know this sounds like a lot, but that's how you develop a real solid company.
Very well said. We talked off camera, off mic recently about how there sometimes seems to be two distinct segments of the transportation logistics industry. You have one segment where they've been around for, decades and, don't fix what isn't like broke. Me. We love the spreadsheets and we know what's worked forever and we're going to continue to make it work. And then there is another side to that coin where it's just every month a new technological advancement, just really opening doors to all sorts of avenues in the transportation logistics industry.
Yeah. How
would you incorporate emerging new technologies and trends into strategic planning in this industry?
That's a really interesting question. So it's a neat way to look at things. And I think it's something that people that have been in the industry in a long time really are challenged with. I've obviously been in the industry longer than I care to admit. I luckily have a bent toward new technologies. I can see why people develop them, and I can see that it kind of goes back to what we were saying before. One of the elements of continually improving is understanding that efficiency within the elements of your company or your business or the industry in a whole, they need to continually be pushed together. I've said this in the past to you off camera as well, that the whole term supply chain is one of my favorite visual terms in our industry, because you can specifically see, you register that there's something on both ends, and that there are this chain in between with all these links, and the amount of links depends on how you want to talk about it. But those links some of them have been around as infrastructural links for as long as there's been transportation logistics. In other links, you can see that they may be easily broken. In the other links, you see that maybe they're so old and not being used much and they need to just be removed by new technologies. The challenge has always been, through most industries, that adopting new technology, being a first adopter especially, is extremely expensive. And there needs to be a lot of additional analysis and strategy around whether we not. Here's an example. I know a company that still uses, there's probably a lot of them, AS400 transportation management software. That's basically a green screen. It has unbelievable robust databases, but it's also very unfriendly to the user. So there's this decision to be made between, especially on the customer service or dispatch side of a lot of companies, whether it's more important to have a data retention field and a lot of minutia taken care of with an unbelievably robust system that has, everybody knows how to fix them, everybody knows how to utilize them in the IT world, or is it better to understand that the workforce is changing so often that the amount of energy and dollars applied to educating new personnel overwhelms the idea of having this? Is it better to have a nice, solid customer and GUI interface, if you will, Or is it better to have this robust database? Well, you want both. But if you want to early adopt to things, then you're going to pay for it big time. Now, today's world, there's so many technologies coming out. I went to a conference not too long ago. Didn't get to stay as long as I wanted, but the conference in transportation called Manifest. It may end up being one of the largest conferences around. It was very big to begin with, but it pointed more at the technological advances. Matter of fact, I recently did a interview with Mr. Brad Young at Third Axiom Solutions, and their big data analytics is driving itself toward, solid kind of analysis, but also the dashboards needed to have people make very quick decisions. Now, part of your question was there's this old school and the kind of new school, and how do you marry them up? Difficult at best. And, a lot of times, and a good friend of mine on another podcast always talking to me about, how the boomers are going to eventually shuffle off anyway. And that's correct. And I'm at the end of the boomer stage, and, eventually I'll, shuffle off, hopefully not the mortal coil for a long time, but certainly out of the spotlight in terms of what we're talking about as far as transportation. But until then, I think analyzing new developing technologies, looking at what applies and can be helpful to progress the KPI importance that you already have for your company is what you look at. So when you go to that continuing improvement process, one of the elements should always be, does this technology help us or hinder us for the things that we feel are important? Does it cost too much now? Do we wait to be third or fourth adopters instead of first adopters? Or is this so important to moving us to the next stage of our development that we need to buy in now?
Yeah, it's definitely old school, new school. Gotta marry them up. That's very true. Well, thank you, Chris, so much for your in-depth discussion on strategic planning. I'm really excited about the next topic.
I am too.
We'll jump into.
I'm glad you brought this one up as the kind of the top rung. All of them are very important, but everything starts with a plan. Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't start with the plan. It starts with the goals, right? In cement. But the real action steps begin when you start to plan things. And trust me, you're going to make a ton of mistakes. I've made more mistakes. I hate to say it, but I've made more mistakes than I've had quote unquote successes along that stair step to where I want to go. But that's part of the fun, actually, is to try to build out solutions, not just for your own company, but also for the partners and affiliates and the collaborators within the industry that you're associated with. And that's the most important element. There's no reason to have a company if it's all inner-focused. You need to have customers. You need to have people engaged. You need to have more people staying engaged than are going out the other side. That's what business is about.
Thank you so much, Chris.
I can't thank you enough. Thank you, Jen, for
of course,
hosting me.